Incredible homemade sheets of pasta, layered with ricotta, herbs, seasonings, layered even more with Italian sausage and marinara sauce. Mozzarella cheese, rolled all up, doubled and rolled again, making one massive log of Italian goodness. Then cut into thick slices, breaded, and fried until golden brown and amazing, all becoming the ridiculous abomination of Italian food that I guess I'm gonna call fried rolled lasagna. John here from Great Lakes Country. Well, I'm sure you saw in the intro and in the thumbnail, today we're making something completely ridiculous and I'm really hoping that it's gonna come out good. I've seen it called Rotolo or just rolled lasagna. I don't know what to call this thing. We've seen rolled lasagna, we've seen breaded and fried lasagna, but I've never seen all of those things coming together into one new type of thing. Quite some time ago, I had this idea. I was making some stuffed manicotti shells or cannelloni shells or whatever you prefer to call them. And I was thinking, man, I'd love to make a massive, gigantic stuffed shell. Something that's basically as big as a Pringles can, but that's one shell. And I thought about how I would roll up a great big piece of pasta dough and fill it and all that, but I quickly determined that there's no way that a giant shell like that wouldn't end up collapsing under its own weight of ricotta and whatever else. So that's when I had the idea of what if I did something kind of in the similar vein, but instead of stuffing a giant hollow shell, I laid it all out and then rolled it up, thereby giving the whole thing more structure of that sort of pasta rigidity that might bring the whole thing together and allow it to sort of exist without collapsing. So I've been tinkering around with that idea for probably a year now, thinking about what I would put in it and how I would do it all and the steps that I would need to take. And today, finally, I've got all the pieces, I've got all the ingredients, I've got everything planned out, and we're gonna be making this entire thing. You may have heard of rolled lasagna. Usually it's one lasagna noodle, some stuff on there, you roll it up. It's about this big. It's cute, you throw it in a pan, you heat it up with some sauce. I'm sure it's delicious. I wanted to make something completely different, something completely new. So we're layering this all up in just so many layers. Cheeses, meats, more cheese, sauce, rolling all that up into some homemade pasta. Then repeating the whole thing, rolling all of that up into some more homemade pasta until we've got just an absolute log of this rolled up thing. Then it's getting sliced into some thick, I guess I'll call them hockey pucks. Then dredged and breaded and fried, with my hopes being that it will all come together in this perfect golden brown crispy package that's warm and gooey on the inside. There's a lot that can go wrong, and I have not done a trial run of this. There's just too much that goes into it for me to want to do all of this another time, especially if it's not going to go well. So win or lose, succeed or fail, it's going in this video, and you're going to see all of it. So there's a lot to do. We're going to move through it all pretty quickly, so let's get right into it and start making this thing. Now we need to start making our ricotta cheese filling. But before we do that, we need to bring in the food processor because this ricotta cheese filling has an herb component to it in the form of lots of flat leaf Italian parsley and lots of fresh basil. And rather than sitting here and finally chopping it all up with a kitchen knife, I might as well just do it the easy way with the food processor because I want a whole bunch of it and I want it to be pretty fine. Something about like that. Now we can mix up this ricotta cheese mixture, starting with 60 ounces of ricotta cheese. And to that we'll add 2 eggs, a nice pinch of black pepper, let's call it half a teaspoon. And we might as well throw in some fresh grated Parmesan cheese. I don't know how much, let's say 1/4 cup. And a whole bunch of those chopped herbs, that basil and that Italian parsley. Probably end up using most of this, let's say something like half a cup. And I know I'm kind of winging the measurements of this as I make this recipe, but don't worry, assuming all of this comes out delicious, I will have the full written out recipe, including specific quantities, in a link in the video description below. Now I'll start to give all of that a little bit of a mix just to get everything kind of pressed down in this mixing bowl. Make everything a little less unwieldy before throwing it onto the stand mixer along with the paddle attachment. And I'll just let this all mix on medium-low speed, just a couple minutes. Get all of those ingredients really incorporated, that thick ricotta with all the herbs and the eggs and everything else. That's looking pretty good to me. I definitely don't want this ricotta mixture to be too thin or loose because it kind of needs to stay in place once it's time to spread it out on some pasta. And this is maybe just on the edge of being a little loose, but after I put this in the fridge for a while, it'll firm up a little more, and I think we're gonna be in really good shape with the consistency of this mixture. And by the way, that is smelling absolutely wonderful right now. That basil coming out of there, delicious. Now here we are over at the stove because it's time to make the meat component of this recipe, which is going to take the form of some beautiful sweet Italian sausage. So I've got my large enamel Dutch oven heating up over medium-high heat, and in goes 3 pounds of this ground Italian sausage. Am I really gonna need 3 pounds of this for this recipe? Probably not, but I don't mind the idea of having some extra in case I need to end up making another instance of this experiment, and at the very least, I've got some extra Italian sausage on hand to do something with. Anyway, I'll let this cook away, breaking it up as it cooks, and I wanna get pretty fine crumbles of that ground sausage, so I'm gonna go at it with a potato masher to break those up even more than a wooden spoon would probably get. And when that Italian sausage is looking nicely browned all the way through, I'll go ahead and transfer it all out of that crock pot with a slotted spoon. And there is a fair amount of grease that has released out of this meat, and I do want to leave as much of that behind in the pot as I can. So with all of the sausage transferred out of that Dutch oven and most of the grease removed as well, except for about 2 tablespoons, we're gonna get that heated back up over about medium-high heat because now we have to cook down some onions and garlic, and we're just gonna be doing it right in some of that sausage grease. So here I've got 1 yellow onion pretty finely chopped up, and we're just gonna give that a saute in all of that grease. Let them get softened, let them get just a little bit brown, a little translucent. And about when these onions are looking beautiful, we're gonna add in about 5 or 6 minced cloves of garlic. And we'll let those cook about 1 full minute. And yes, right about now is when my kitchen is beginning to smell absolutely delicious. Between all that basil and now this Italian sausage and the onions and garlic, there's no way that's not gonna smell good. All right, heat's off, and now we're returning all of that ground sausage to the pot. And I have had this ground meat sitting in a colander for just a few minutes to make sure all the rest of that excess grease can drain out, because I really don't want this meat to be soggy or sopping wet with grease specifically when this all ends up going into our crazy lasagna roll thing. So just get all those onions and garlic mixed all in there. Make sure to make a huge mess all over the stove as usual. I've spent a good amount of time trying to think of how I wanted to exactly prepare this ground sausage mixture. And I've also been thinking about how to incorporate some marinara sauce into this recipe. I don't want this thing drenched or sopping wet because ultimately it's getting fried in oil. But I do think I want some nice marinara flavors inside of this. And I'm also looking at my ground sausage crumbles, and I can't help but think I wish they were a little more crumbly. This needs to be spread out in sort of a thin layer over a long stretch of pasta dough. And everything needs to be pretty even and level when it's on there. So I kind of think I want to break these crumbles up even further, and I'm going to do that with the help of, once again, the stand mixer. And I think this might also be a great time to incorporate some of that marinara flavor by way of mixing it right into this sausage. Not so much that it's soupy or like a sauce with sausage in it, more like sausage with a little bit of sauce in it. So I'm thinking maybe about, I don't know, 1/3 of a cup, maybe not quite 1/2 a cup, something like that. And let's just let that mix for a couple minutes and see how it's looking. If the consistency and wetness seems about right, then I think we're good. And I'm thinking that's looking pretty nice to me. It's not soaking wet. It's not like sloppy Joe, but it's got some moisture to it. Those sausage crumbles are broken up even finer, and the whole thing is gonna spread onto that pasta, not quite like a paste, but sort of fine and malleable enough that I think it's gonna create a really nice even layer all the way across. So now all of our fillings are pretty much ready, so I think we can move on to the pasta step. Now we can finally start making the dough for our pasta sheets that we're gonna need for this whole thing. And this is basically my standard ravioli dough, and it starts with 290 grams of double O flour, and we'll just sort of make a little well in the middle here. Not that it matters that much when we're doing it with the mixer, which I am definitely going to. And then into that I will pour 5 egg yolks and 2 whole eggs. And I'll also sprinkle over about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and let's call that 1 teaspoon of olive oil. I'll give all those eggs a little bit of a precursory mix with a fork just to kind of break those yolks up. And then we're doing the rest of this in the stand mixer. I'll get started with the regular paddle attachment. Get that going on low speed just until all those ingredients are pretty much incorporated. It's just gonna take a minute or two, and I'm gonna keep this thing on the lowest speed. And when everything's looking pretty mashed together, definitely not a cohesive dough yet, I'm going to switch out the paddle attachment for the dough hook. And then back on lowest speed for just a couple, 2, 3, 4 minutes until everything's really started to work together and is taking the shape of a pasta dough. And at this point, we've got ourselves something that almost looks like a hunk of pasta dough, but it still needs a little bit more kneading, and there's really no substitution for doing some of this by hand. It really needs some good squishing and kneading to really work all of the wet from those eggs into the dry of the flour. Make sure everything's nice and hydrated and evenly distributed. We need to develop that gluten quite a bit for a good pasta dough. So I'll just squish it and knead it here on the counter for, I don't know, about another 3 minutes. It starts off seeming kind of crumbly, but just keep going, keep kneading, and it's all gonna come together into a beautiful little piece of dough. And once it looks something about like that, we're finished, at least for now. But I do need to wrap it up nice and tight in some plastic and just let that sit here on the counter for 30 to 60 minutes. Not really any less than 30, not really any more than 60. Now this is kind of a standard ordinary batch if you were doing pasta night for, a couple few people. But for this ridiculous thing that I'm making in this video, I actually need a triple batch. So I'm gonna repeat all of this 2 more times. Yeah, if I had a much bigger mixer, I could have just done one great big batch, but that little KitchenAid mixer I have even starts to struggle a little bit with just this much of that dense pasta dough. So not really a big deal. I'll just do 3 smaller batches and then we'll pick it up in a little bit. Now that all of our pasta dough has been made and wrapped up in the plastic, I just gotta let it sit here until that last one I made has been sitting at least 30 minutes. And then we'll finally be just about ready to start building this monstrosity. Now I normally, when I'm working at the counter, I do everything on this wooden cutting board. But today we're gonna need a little bit more room. So I'm unfortunately gonna have to zoom out quite a bit, get the cutting board out of the way, and we're just gonna have to deal with these extremely ugly countertops of mine. So we are gonna be working with these 3 batches of dough separately because I don't really wanna keep them uncovered and unwrapped for too long at a time because that dough will dry out. Now the way I wanna build this whole thing calls for 3 wide, long layers of pasta dough rolled into sheets. And each one of those layers is pretty much gonna be one of these batches of pasta dough. But the width of this pasta roller here isn't wide enough for what I wanna do. So I actually need to do 2 strips, so to speak, and then join them together. So I'll start by cutting this piece of dough in half. I'll just eyeball it. I think I can get pretty close. And while I'm working with one, I will keep the other one wrapped up in the plastic. And from here on out, I am gonna wanna keep this whole surface floured pretty generously because as soon as I set these sheets of pasta on anything, they're gonna wanna stick, especially these Formica countertops. So now using the handy KitchenAid pasta roller attachment, which makes things just so much easier when you don't have to use one hand on one of those crank machines, which I have and I used for years, but it sure makes it a lot easier when you don't need that extra hand and you can use both for the actual pasta sheets. So I'm gonna get this thing just flattened out a little bit. We're gonna start on the widest setting this thing has, which says number 8. And I'll start on a pretty slow setting on the mixer. And I just need to feed the thing through. I'll let it go through one time. And if after any of the passes through those rollers, your dough seems like it's got any kind of tackiness or stickiness to it, we don't want that. That's gonna make it stick to those rollers and sort of drag instead of roll. So I'll just give them a very light dust with some of that double O flour. Don't have to go crazy, but it's really gonna be hard to over flour it, so don't worry too much about that. Then I'll adjust the little dial on the machine to narrow those rollers together one more notch, run all that through. Each time it goes through, it makes the dough thinner, it makes it longer. Hopefully it widens it out so it'll be a nice rectangle, just the width of those rollers. And I'll just keep repeating. I'll pass it through once, adjust the dial down one size, and keep going until I've got the thickness I want. And that right there is about the thickness I'm going for. On this machine, it's number 4. It's not quite as thin as classic ravioli dough might be, and maybe about as thick as, let's say, a lasagna noodle, which is really kind of fitting because that's sort of what this whole thing is gonna be, in a sense. So I've got my first half of the first layer, so now I'll repeat and make another one of these. All right, and when I've got my 2 pasta sheets and they're somewhere in the neighborhood of equal, I'll slightly overlap one over the other such that I have a layer about that wide. And then I'm just gonna use the rolling pin to gently squish these 2 layers together at that seam. Don't need to go crazy just by sitting on top of one another. They're gonna end up sticking together, but giving them a light little press is gonna help kind of bind them together. I could have also just get a little water on there and glue them together, but I do want that seam to be a little bit flattened out, hence the rolling pin. And I might as well come in and tidy up the ends just a little bit so everything is square. This side doesn't look bad, but I'll give it a little bit of a trim. Now I just need to set this completed sheet aside until I'm ready to start building my layers, but I have to make sure that I keep it completely covered with some plastic wrap while I'm working on those other ones, or a lightly damp towel, just something to make sure that the air stays off of it so this thing doesn't dry out before we're ready to use it. In the meantime, I'm gonna get my 4 other sheets rolled out to create my 2 other layers, just like I did here. And I guess I don't need to show you all of that because it's just doing all of this over again, exactly the same. So let's jump forward a little bit when we're finally ready to start building this thing. All right, let's see if we can't bring this thing to life. First, some more flour on the counter because this is where things really might start sticking. Then our first layer of pasta dough. Now we're bringing back that ricotta mixture with that delicious basil and the parsley and the Parmesan in there. And we're gonna spread out a relatively thin layer all across this sheet of pasta. I really don't know quite how much I'm gonna need for each layer. I wanna go pretty much wall to wall. Yeah, that's looking really nice to me. That's just about the perfect consistency for what I'm trying to do here. Come to think of it, I do wanna leave just a little bit of space at the end for when I roll this thing up. I'll have a little surface to sort of glue it together with. I really should get one of those little offset canted cake icing spreader things. What are those things called? That would be perfect here. Of course, since I spent many a day as a house painter a long time ago, I almost think something like a flexible spackle blade would be perfect for this, but I'm gonna make this little spreader thingy work just fine. Next, we need a layer of that ground sausage with the onion and garlic and that little bit of marinara mixed in, just to kind of help bind everything together, make it a little more cooperative when we need to spread it around. I really want just about the thinnest layer that this ground meat mixture will allow. 'Cause this thing's already gonna be pretty fat and ridiculous. I also don't wanna run out of meat, and I just can't even imagine having 3 pounds of sausage in here, not having enough. And when we start cooking this thing, we're gonna want that heat to be able to penetrate all the way through to the innermost layer, warm everything up. I think we do need to introduce just a little bit of mozzarella into this whole ensemble. Again, I don't want to go too crazy because we got lots of layers left to go, but I will give just a light sprinkling all across. Now, one of many moments of truth, and that is, can I actually roll this thing? If I can get it started, I think I can keep it going. And almost immediately, I am starting to think that 3 layers was too ambitious, and I might be modifying my whole plan on this thing and going 2 layers, because this is already ridiculous, and I should have left a little bit more room at the end for that gluing. So here's what I'm gonna try to do. If I can just kind of relocate some of this stuff at the end, and give it a little bit of moisture, just brush some water on there. And let's see if I can close this up. Well, that is indeed ridiculous. And I know these ends are pretty open and they're a little unwieldy. That's all gonna be taken care of. Don't you worry about any of that. But right now, my first layer of lasagna log is rolled up. I'm calling that a win. Now let's reset our working surface, clean it up. I need to get this thing moved out of the way for now, so I will, once again, generously flour a little sheet pan here and get this beast moved over to it. Now I'm gonna get this covered with some plastic while we work on the next and possibly final layer. So we'll just repeat that whole process, get that counter nice and floured, lay out the next sheet of dough, spread out a nice thin layer of that ricotta mixture, nice thin as possible layer of the meat mixture, some mozzarella cheese, and then we bring the first log back in and attempt to roll the second layer around it. And this is where things might start to get real hairy, but we're just gonna see what we can do, keep this whole thing together. I think my second layer was quite as wide as the first, so that might pose a problem, but we're gonna worry about that in a minute. A little bit of water for some glue. And I'd love to make this thing even bigger with a third layer, but I think that would just be downright reckless to try, because as it stands, this thing's already trying to collapse under its own weight. It's ridiculously heavy. It's almost impossible to move around. So before we go any further, we need to wrap this thing up in some plastic. Just like we would do with something like a beef Wellington, we need to give this thing a tight wrap in some plastic and let it sit in the fridge for a good while so it can kind of firm up. That dough layer, or in this case, many layers, can kind of reshape and get back into something that might resemble round. I'm gonna tell you, this thing is pretty tricky to deal with, a lot trickier than a Wellington, let me tell you. We're just gonna try to get it as tight as possible without risking breaking it or splitting it or otherwise mangling it. Oh my God, this is just ridiculous. I don't really have enough plastic left over at the ends to really spin it tight. That's okay. We're gonna be trimming these kind of sloppy ends off anyway before this thing really goes a lot further. But just to make sure it's good and sealed, I should put another sheet of plastic long ways just to make sure. Now this absolute beast has to go in the fridge for a while. I don't really know how long. I'm gonna start with an hour, see how it's feeling after that. I really need this thing to firm up quite a bit before I can start doing any kind of cutting into it. I'll probably give it a roll every few minutes as it firms up, just to make sure it kind of retains that round shape that I really want. We're gonna fast forward a little while and just see how we're doing with this thing. Well, it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of about an hour, and I actually moved this into the freezer after just a few minutes. I realized I need this thing to be a lot firmer than what that fridge is gonna be able to accomplish. It's definitely a lot more rigid than when I put it in there. It's not frozen solid by any means. It's really still pretty pliable, but it's a lot more firm than it was. Now, I bet this thing would be outrageous if I was to put it in a great big casserole dish and pour some marinara sauce on it and some mozzarella and bake it for a while. In fact, that might be something I just have to try one of these days. But the idea that I've been working on involves slicing this thing up. So that's what we must do. I think the first thing I really need to do here is kind of clean up the end. You can see this thing didn't really roll very evenly, and I really want a nice square end before I really start cutting off my slices, and I won't let this whole end piece go to waste. Maybe I'll do that thing with the marinara sauce in the oven like I was just talking about. Look at that. Look at the insides of that thing. That's gonna be delicious no matter what I do to it. But as for getting ourselves a few, I guess I'll call them pinwheels or something, that can eventually be breaded and fried, I need to cut me some slices. And I'm not exactly sure how thick I ought to go. It needs to keep some structure, so I don't want to go too thin. Maybe something about like that. And I definitely could have let this go a little longer in the freezer, but I needed it to still be soft enough that I could easily cut through them pasta layers. Now I'll gently place this on some parchment paper on a baking sheet, because these are definitely gonna have to go back into the freezer for a little while to get more firm and to really set up before I start the breading and deep frying step. Not to mention letting them lay on their side and freezing a little bit will make sure they stay a nice round shape instead of this sort of flattened out oval that they want to become by laying on their side like this. And those are looking pretty amazing to me. Just think of all the different things I could do with these to heat these up, make them cheesy or saucy or otherwise delicious. I'm really happy with how those are looking so far. But for now, back into the freezer this whole tray goes until these things are pretty firm up. Not necessarily frozen rock solid, but somewhere maybe between what they are now and solid. Alright, here we are a little while later, and these things have definitely firmed up quite a bit. I wouldn't say that they're rock solid, but they're definitely firm enough to hold their shape, and nothing's looking like it has any risk of falling apart. So now, I really just need to pick which one I think is the nicest, so we can do our first test breading and frying. They all look pretty darn nice to me, but I think I've got my eye on this one. Just look at all those layers in there. So here we've got a classic dredging station setup, and we're gonna try breading this thing just like we might anything else. First, by giving it a dusting of some all-purpose flour. I don't know how much is gonna stick to that outside layer of pasta, but we gotta get some good stickage to those, those inside layers there on the sides. Really just need to create kind of a fresh surface to which the egg wash and the breadcrumbs can stick to. And something I almost forgot, here I've got my breadcrumbs, and these are just ordinary breadcrumbs, but I want to season them a little bit. So I'm going to add some Italian seasoning to that, and just a little bit of kosher salt in there. Just another layer of flavor to add to this whole thing. Now we got our floured up disc o lasagna, and we can give it the old egg bath. Make sure we got some good coverage. Let some excess drain off and into the breadcrumbs. Want some nice solid coating all over with them breadcrumbs, because that's where the magic is gonna happen. And honestly, this is the part where things might get a little precarious, and I don't know how this whole thing's gonna go. None of the pasta sheets are pre-cooked in any way. They're not dried pasta, so they don't necessarily need to be rehydrated, but something that can happen if you deep fry fresh pasta is that it turns crispy instead of soft. So I need my breadcrumb layer to act as a protective barrier to keep the hot oil from really directly touching the pasta, but we still need all that heat from the oil to penetrate all the way through, so this little disc of lasagna will get nice and hot all the way to the middle. And I think it's going to. In fact, just as I've been handling this, I can definitely feel that it's still soft in the middle. So I don't think we're gonna have any problems, but I really don't know because I've never done anything like this before. Anyway, that's looking like a very nice breaded hockey puck of lasagna. So I think we can move over to the stove and give this thing a try. So here we've got some vegetable oil heating up in my big Dutch oven, and I'm not really doing a deep fry. This is kind of a shallow fry. It's not gonna completely submerge, so we're gonna have to flip it over, and it would probably be a little easier to use one of my big deep cast iron skillets for this, but there's a lot of wet stuff on the inside of this lasagna roll, and if I do get a breach in that breading, I don't know what kind of spattery mess I might be looking at. So I figured the bigger vessel, giving myself a little more room to work with, is probably the smart move. So now, with that oil heated up to 350 degrees, I will gently lay in my breaded slice of lasagna roll. And right away, lots of good things seem to be happening. Getting some good sizzle. I'll just help the top along here by spooning over some of that hot oil just to get that breading to set up. Don't want any of it breaking off, floating away. But I'm definitely starting to get some brown crispiness on the bottom and sides, I think. And I have to figure out the most careful and cautious way to turn this thing pretty soon here. I think what I'll do is just try to get under it a little bit. Looks like I got a little bare spot right in the middle where it was sitting on the bottom. I think we're just about there. I don't want that to get too much more brown because I don't want to risk burning anything. So out it comes, no breaches, no leaks. God, that's exactly what I wanted to see. And I'll get that little beauty transferred over to a wire rack, let it sit for just a couple minutes. Then I think we're gonna be just about ready to cut into that thing and see how we did. All right, I think we're just about there. We just need to dress this little thing up with a couple more little components. First, I think we need some marinara sauce just drizzled over top. Not too much because I don't want this to just be a marinara heavy dish where that flavor completely drowns out everything else. But I do think a touch would definitely be a welcome addition. Then how about a light sprinkle of some little Parmesan matchsticks or shreds or whatever you call those things. And lastly, just for a touch of color, a very light sprinkling of some of that chopped up parsley and basil. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that is looking absolutely magnificent, and I can't in good conscience make you or me wait any longer before I cut into that thing and see how the inside came out. Crispy, golden brown, breaded deliciousness? I think so. All right, let's do this. I say we go right down the middle. Just look at that cross section. Look at all the different layers of that noodle from rolling it up. Little walls separating that sausage and the ricotta mixture and those herbs. I can't wait any longer. I gotta have a bite. If this thing is as good as it looks, I'm gonna be a real happy guy. Wow, I don't even know what to say about that. Hands down, one of the best Italian dishes I've ever made, and definitely the best one that I came up with. There's just so much going on. No one flavor is overwhelming any others, but there's just so much to love. Right away, it's a little reminiscent of a mozzarella stick. There's not a lot of mozzarella in there, but when you got some of that mozz and crispy golden fried breading and a little marinara sauce, that's gonna invoke some mozzarella stick memories. Then that ricotta filling. I love all of that basil coming through. I think I need to start putting a lot more basil in my regular lasagna because that is just a welcome flavor coming through all of that. The Italian sausage, of course, delicious. The little touch of marinara mixed in with it. And of course, the little bit that I put on top. There's just not enough words to fully express how happy I am with how this came out. There was a lot of wild cards in this thing. First, is the whole roll of stuff gonna stay together? Is it gonna maintain its shape? Is it gonna just split apart and ooze everywhere? Then, will I be able to get it firmed up enough in the fridge or freezer such that I could slice it and have it all still stay together in these little discs? Then, of course, when it's time to bread and fry them, is that breading gonna stick? Is there gonna be a blowout or a breach where stuff starts leaking and spilling out of it? If not, will the hot oil be enough to get all the way through to the middle to heat everything through after it had been in that freezer? And finally, how will that homemade pasta come out? And I gotta say, it came out beautifully. It had maybe the slightest bit of chew, pretty much like you'd want from an al dente pasta, but in something that's sort of essentially a lasagna. Normally a lasagna noodle is gonna be pretty mushy by the time it's been parboiled and layered and then baked for quite some time. This, I don't even know. I don't think I've had a sheet noodle like that with that consistency and texture before, and I'm a big fan of it. Anyway, I'd thought that I might need a contingency plan if this frying method just went horribly and there wasn't really anything worth even sharing and showing and eating. I was thinking I would take one of those discs of rolled lasagna and maybe put it in a little pan with some marinara, bake it for a while, maybe throw some mozzarella on there to help glue the whole thing together if it was otherwise going to be a disaster. But I'm telling you, I don't think I need any of that. This thing maintained its shape so good. Look at all that. There's some of that mozzarella and ricotta just oozing out of there now. This thing maintained its shape so well, I think I could just eat it by hand just like this. In fact, I don't mind if I do. There was a lot of work that went into making this thing, but it was totally worth it. I'm so glad I did it. It was a great experiment. And you know, all those other discs that I cut, they're still on the sheet tray in the freezer. I don't see why I couldn't vacuum seal those, store them in there, and then make them later whenever I want. Maybe thaw them out a little bit, about halfway, and then cook them either with some sauce in the oven or do the breading and the deep frying. But the point is, none of that massive roll of lasagna is gonna go to waste. And I'm really happy that there's a bunch of it because I really wanna make this for some friends and family and have them taste it. There's no one else here right now. It's just me. I'm the only one that can marvel in how good this came out. Anyway, I guess I'll stop patting myself on the back for now and say that I definitely am going to write out the full recipe and put a link to it in the video description below because this is absolutely worth sharing. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future cooking, Italian food, and food experiment videos. Thanks for watching and sticking with me through this whole ridiculous video. That's it for now, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.